All right, thank you very much for your patience. Welcome to Discovering Your Story at the Rhode Island State Archives. Before we get started, I have a few quick housekeeping announcements just to get you up to speed. First, as you probably noticed, just be advised that you'll be muted throughout the presentation and all video has been turned off. We've done this for two reasons. First, for your own privacy, and also so we have the best video quality for the upload to YouTube later on, because this will be available on demand. You can, and we encourage you to, drop any questions you have in the chat, and we'll gladly answer them at the end of the presentation. That's the main housekeeping we have. We're looking forward to really launching in and giving you some great information about the State Archives and our collection. But first, we have a quick welcome and introduction for you from Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea before we dive in.
Hi, I'm Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea, and I'm here to welcome you to our new virtual programs at the Rhode Island State Archives. Right now, the archives is currently open on a limited appointment-only basis, but my team and I have created a new series of virtual programs to continue to share our more than 10 million remarkable records with you. We hope you enjoy this program from home or wherever you are, and that you'll take this as an opportunity to explore our collection from family history to voting and much, much more. If you have any questions, please contact us so our team can help you with your research. Have fun, and I hope to see you in the State Archives one day soon.
So as Secretary Gorbea said, we are the Rhode Island State Archives, and we welcome you to this new virtual program and virtual space. A quick note about the Rhode Island State Archives itself. We are one of the three public-facing parts or divisions of the Department of State. We are under the Division of Archives, Library, and Public Information. We work very hard in order to bring information to the public, and part of that is through programs like these. The other divisions that are public-facing and work daily, much like us, with the everyday people of Rhode Island, would be elections and business services. But the State Archives itself is responsible for preserving and making available for research Rhode Island's historical public records, our oldest of which dates to 1638. We also have two sort of subdivisions that are part of our office. The first being the Public Records Administration, which Rich Height, who's going to lead you through this presentation, is an integral part of, and the Local Government Records Program, which if you're familiar with your cities and towns, you may have heard of that program as well. So discovering your story at the Rhode Island State Archives, chances are, if any members of your family have lived in Rhode Island for any extended period of time, we probably have some record of their existence. Sources prior to the mid-18th and mid-20th centuries may be limited, but we do have documents here that date back to 1638, so there's a plethora of what we can provide. So now I'm actually going to pass this presentation over to Rich Height, who's our State Records Coordinator and a rather expert genealogist who's going to share with you some tips and tricks and just some great information that will help you in your family history research.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. This slide refers to the items we house as treasures. And for those researching their family history in Rhode Island, many of them are. More than 10 million records are housed at the State Archives, having been accumulated by the state over a period of more than 380 years. Now, more than 3,000 of these records are now available as online images, and that number is continuing to increase. In my opinion, there are two primary building blocks for reconstructing family lineages for the 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States. One is vital records, that is, records of births, marriages, and deaths. And the other one is census records. The Rhode Island State Archives has both, and they are the most useful records for genealogists when they are in the stage of trying to trace lineages back further than they already have them. Vital records could be called the cornerstone of genealogical research. They are the sources genealogists most often turn to first to trace families back for more generations than they already know. And when they are available, They provide the most useful information for that purpose. Rhode Island began requiring the statewide recording of births, marriages, and deaths in 1853. That does not mean they are 100% complete. Recording them was required by law, but there was little means to enforce it, especially for those living in isolated areas. The State Archives has the earliest of these records. Currently, the Archives has the state's birth records from 1853 until 1919, marriage records for that same time span, and death records from 1853 until 1869. These records are all initially filed in the Vital Records Office of the Department of Health. For privacy reasons, birth and marriage records remain at the Department of Health for 100 years after the event, and death records stay there for 50 years. After those lapses of time, the records are turned over to the State Archives. From 1853 until the summer of 1921, these records were maintained in ledger books. Beginning in July of 1921, individual certificates were issued for each of these events. The Archives currently has no birth or marriage certificates and will not until early in 2022, when we obtain the 1921 records for those events. We have individual death certificates for deaths in Rhode Island from the summer of 1921 through 1969. In most situations, the obvious first place to look is a birth record. For example, if you're looking for an ancestor born in 1859, you will want to look at the 1859 birth records. Not sure of which town this ancestor was born in? That's no problem. We have statewide indexes. The earliest of these statewide birth records are going to give the name of the child, the date of birth, the names of the parents, race, the occupation of the father. At that time period, it was assumed that mothers would be housekeepers with no job that earned income, and the birthplace of each parent. In some instances, the maiden name of the mother might be given, and that became more frequent as time went on. Through the years, the birth records got more detailed. Eventually, they gave information such as the age of each parent and the number of children the mother had previously given birth to. I cannot state a specific year for this because there were variations from town to town. The marriage records are equally informative. From the very beginning in 1853, they give the date of marriage, the names and ages of the bride and groom, the place of residence and birthplace of each one, race, the occupation of the groom, and the names of the parents of both parties. And if one gets lucky, the maiden name of a mother might be included. For people born in Rhode Island in the 1830s and 1840s, these are the most obvious records to use to identify their parents, because while they may have been born too early to have their births recorded, a marriage record will give that information. People are generally going to know the names of their own parents, so these are usually pretty reliable sources of that information. Occasionally, there can be a glitch. For example, someone whose mother died in childbirth and whose father remarried within a year or two might name his or her stepmother here, because the stepmother might be the only mother the person ever knew. Checking marriage records for siblings of the bride or groom, if you have that information, is a good idea for comparative purposes. 3 or 4 records giving the same parents' names are always better than one. And for people born earlier in the 19th century, or in the last quarter of the 18th century and died after 1853, a death record may be the only vital record in existence. Death records give the date and place of death and the age, which may be as specific as down to the day, such as 80 years, 4 months, and 17 days, just to give an example, and that would allow one to calculate the exact date of birth. They also give the occupation of the deceased, although the earliest records will specify if a male above the age of 15, and they also give the race of the deceased. The cause of death is given, and there's a slot that asks for the names of the parents. There's no certainty that that slot will be filled in, though, and the information on that is only as good as the knowledge of the person who provided it. That does not mean it is wrong. It's part of what I refer to as written oral history. That is, history that is written solely on what people remember from the past. If the deceased had a living spouse, that person is a likely candidate to have provided the parents' names. But if not, a child of the deceased is more likely. In any case, if the names of the parents are given, no one should take it for granted that names are correct, especially if the maiden name of the mother is included. In many cases, the earliest death records only give the name of the deceased person's father anyway. And again, if one knows the name of any siblings of the deceased, it's a good idea to check those also. But ultimately, one may need to check probate records in towns to prove the names of parents of people born and married prior to 1853. But the clues given in death records, when they are there, should never be ignored. While no source of statewide vital records exists prior to 1853, there are some available. James N. Arnold, who was editor of the Narragansett Historical Register, compiled and published what he could extract from town records in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some of these records date back as far as 1636, when the colony was established, but they are sporadic at best. The reference archivist here at the archives estimated that about 15% of the marriages that took place in the colony and later the state were recorded prior to 1853. About 10% of births and no more than 2 to 3% of deaths. When they were recorded, they rarely included as much information as the later records. For example, marriage and death records were unlikely to note the names of the parents of those involved. These records could be extracted from town meeting records, town council records, or land evidence. There were also towns that began keeping vital records before the state mandated it. The ones in town council records could have been created when a resident of a particular town simply decided to enter the record of his family there. He might have brought his Bible along to a town meeting and entered the names of himself, his wife, and the names of all of his children, along with birth dates. The archives has copies on microfilm of nearly all of the records that Arnold cites in these publications, and we have copies of the publications themselves. The exceptions are the records from New Shoreham and 3 volumes of records from Warwick. Now, Arnold also lists births, marriages, and deaths that were mentioned in newspapers. The archives does not have copies of newspapers in its collections, but we do have Arnold's volumes that cite those entries. Now, while vital records document specific individuals at the time of major events in their lives, census records reconstruct complete households. At various moments in time, government entities compile census records for the purpose of documenting the populations under their jurisdictions. These listings of complete households often provide, in one record, information that it would take 10 or more vital records to compile. The State Archives has census records dating from the colonial period. Microfilm copies of the surviving federal census records for the state from 1790 through 1930, and the existing census records compiled by the state. The earliest colony census record is from 1774, and then there's a military census from 1777, which lists only men of the appropriate age to bear arms. And there's also a state census from 1782. After that, the state did not compile a census again until 1865, and it was continued after that every 10 years until 1935, notably in the years that fell between federal census years. The census records prior to 1850, colony, state, and federal, only list household heads by name. They then break spouses and children down by age categories, and they got more specific as time went on. The 1790 census only listed the numbers of males age 16 above in the household, the number of males under 16, and the total number of females with no age breakdown at all. By 1840, they were breaking children down into age groups of under 5, of 5 but under 10, of 10 but under 15, and of 15 and under 20. For adults, it was broken up into 10-year increments, from of 20 and under 30 up to of 90 and under 100. And there was also a category for 100 and above. The 1850 federal census was the first one to name every person in the household. That being the case, the census makes it possible to trace most families back a couple of decades earlier than the statewide vital records can, because in most cases, children 15 and younger were still living with their parents. And in a large number of instances, people in their early 20s who were still unmarried continued to live at home. So in the 1850 census, one might find people born as early as the 1820s still living in their parents' household. This census gives the name of each individual, the age, and place of birth, although it's no more specific than the state if born in the United States, and if born outside the United States, it simply gives the country. As time went on, census takers began asking for more information. Starting in 1880, they asked for the relationship of every person in the household to the head of the household. The husband, if living, would be listed as the household head. If not, the widow would be listed. The wife, of course, is listed as the wife of the household head, and each of the children would be listed as son or daughter. In some cases, an elderly parent of the husband or wife might be there and would be listed as father, mother, father-in-law, or mother-in-law of the household head. There could be brothers or sisters of the household head, nieces or nephews, or unrelated people who might be listed as servants or boarders. This continued for every census through 1930. Another piece of information that began to be included in 1880 was the birthplaces of the parents of each person listed, again, state or country. Now, this is another piece of information that has to be classified as written oral history, because one cannot assume that everyone knew precisely where their parents were born. And there's always the chance that the person who provided the information was not the individual cited in the record. Beginning in 1900, census takers began noting the year of arrival in the United States for foreign-born residents. Whether or not the person was a naturalized citizen, which is noted by NA, an alien denoted by AL, or had filed citizenship papers, but the process was still ongoing, which was noted as PA. In 1910, people were asked if they spoke English or not, and if not, what language they did speak. In 1920, immigrants were asked what their mother tongue was, even if they spoke English by that time. The children were asked the mother tongue of their parents. The first of the state censuses of Rhode Island to list every member of the household was 1865. They are sporadic in how useful they are to genealogists. The 1865 and 1875 censuses list every member of the household in much the same fashion as the federal census records. For individuals born in Rhode Island, they include a specific piece of information that the federal census records do not. They give the town the person was born in. Now, the 1885 census is not nearly so useful because it does not organize people by household. 1895 exists only for Providence. The 1905 census includes cards for each individual listed and gives an address. Women are listed separately from men, so to reconstruct an entire household, one must look through every one of a particular surname and note the ones at the same address as the specific individual being searched for. 1915 and 1925 are more conventional. They list every member of the household and also note whether foreign-born residents are naturalized. 1935 is similar to 1905. Well, the State Archives also has a collection of published city and town directories from all over the state, but it is far from complete. Some are on microfilm and some are actual printed copies. The earliest one that the Archives has is an 1824 directory of Providence. Actual relationship information in these records is limited, but looking for others with the same surname can lead researchers to hints about connections. Following a family in directories over a period of several years can also show how long they lived in a specific address or in a particular town. Usually the only name listed is the household head, whose name is given with the street address and usually occupation. In some cases, if the household head is a man, his wife's name may be given in parentheses. For example, if we had a Quahog, Rhode Island town directory and Peter Griffin is listed, the name Lois might be listed in parentheses after his, indicating that she's his wife. And it should also give his occupation, which is brewery shipping clerk. If the household head is a widow, the name of her deceased husband is often given. Again, from a Quahog town directory, Lois Griffin, widow of Peter, if Peter had died. But there are other clues that can be found. For instance, people in their late teens and early 20s who still live with their parents and have jobs might be listed separately, but at the same address. For example, the aforementioned Lois Griffin might have been listed alone for several years at 31 Spooner Avenue in Quahog. But then a year might come that lists another individual, Stewie Griffin, occupation motivational speaker, who boards at 31 Spooner Avenue. When seeing that, one can conclude that Stewie Griffin is probably a son of the widow Lois Griffin, and obviously also of her late husband Peter Griffin. Researchers should also check other records to verify this, of course, like vital records and census records. But this is an important clue. Now let's come to military records. Generally, military records provide very little information on intergenerational relationships, although there are a few Civil War records that do. However, they document a part of ancestors' lives that descendants are often very interested in, and for that reason, they are some of our most heavily utilized sources. They are a necessity for researchers interested in hereditary societies such as the Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm going to mention a few highlights of the State Archives sources here. There are no fewer than 19 volumes from the years of the Revolutionary War and immediately after that document the service of Rhode Islanders in the Continental Army during that time or in local militia units. Our reference archivist, Ken Carlson, has compiled a detailed name index of these volumes. In most cases, these are just rosters that say no more about a soldier or militia member than his name and rank. For militia members, the list itself will usually note place of residence. Civil War records are generally more detailed, and there are certain ones that will give information on family relationships. Soldiers who were under the age of 21 had to have the signed consent of a parent or guardian in order to enlist, and the relationship is noted. Usually the father, but it could be the mother or even a grandfather if the father was deceased. The Civil War regimental rosters typically give name, age, and physical descriptions such as height, hair color, and eye color, birthplace, and occupation. The archives has rosters of each regiment with the names in alphabetical order. If you happen to be lucky enough to have an ancestor who served in the 11th Rhode Island Regiment, the archives has a unique source. In 1863, a genealogist took the trouble of preparing a roster of the regiment that listed each soldier's wife and children by name, the soldier's parents, and even grandparents when the information could be obtained. So the descendants of the troops of this regiment have a gold mine at their disposal, and the archives has this volume on microfilm. For Rhode Islanders who served in World War I, the archives has service cards. They give the enlistee's name, age at time of enlistment, date of enlistment, address, and some details about the person's service. The records are separated by branch. As an example, I recall the card of a sailor named George A. Bailey, who was a resident of Newport and served in the Navy. He was 29 when he enlisted in 1917, which meant he was born about 1887 or 88. The card indicates that he served on the ship USS Cyclops, and it notes that the ship was lost on June 14, 1918. That date is also given as this sailor's date of death. But in reality, no one knows what really happened to this ship. The date given is the last known contact or sighting of it. It actually vanished somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle. But for more recent wars, such as World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, records at the archives are sparse. I would suggest contacting the reference archivist before coming in to research veterans of those wars. Now, everyone who starts work on genealogy is advised to talk to older family members and find out what they know. Now, this is sound advice, but one has to bear in mind that it's also necessary to verify what these family members tell, not just to take it for granted that everything told is exactly right and build on it. What members of previous generations of our families tell us is what is called oral history. And oral history is not documented history. That does not mean it's always wrong. In fact, much of it is accurate. But to assume that it is always accurate is a mistake. And if not verified, it can lead to years of frustration trying to prove a lineage with a starting point that wasn't correct in the first place. And even with primary sources, errors that are transmitted orally can creep in. Certain types of original records are more prone to error than others because of the types of information they ask for. For example, beginning in 1880, the United States Census asked for the birthplaces of the parents of each individual. One cannot take it for granted that everyone knows that information. I've seen numerous cases to which the responses to this question vary from one census to the other for the same person. And one can also never know who provided the census takers with the information. There were undoubtedly instances when census takers arrived at a household when parents are away. In these cases, teenagers or children even younger may have been the ones who answered the questions. This would involve asking these children not only where their parents were born, but also their grandparents on behalf of their parents. There's certainly no guarantee these answers are correct. Another type of record that lists where parents of an individual were born is a death certificate. In these cases, the deceased himself or herself is obviously not providing the information. It's usually a spouse or child. These birthplaces are probably usually correct, but no researcher should ever take that for granted. Multiple sources should be checked to verify the information found on these death certificates. Now, death certificates often list the name of the parents of the deceased, but again, it's only as good as the knowledge of the person who provided it. Most people know the names of their grandparents, but there's room for error, particularly when it comes to the maiden names of grandmothers. For instance, I was once searching for the names of the parents of one of my great-great-grandmothers, whose maiden name was Mary Etta Bowling. She died in North Carolina in 1889, which was before death records were created in that state. I had learned, however, that she'd had a brother named Charles Bowling who outlived her by about 60 years. When I obtained his death certificate, it gave his parents' names as William Bowling and Sarah Angel, and I initially assumed that I had the correct names of another generation. Eventually, though, I found the family and census records. William was the correct name of the father, but the name of his wife was given as Elizabeth rather than Sarah. Marietta and Charles, both born in the 1850s, were in the household at that time, and I just thought that their mother, Sarah Angel, had died and Elizabeth was their stepmother. But then I located a marriage record of William Bowling and Elizabeth Martin in 1846. So it was obvious. Elizabeth Martin was their mother, not Sarah Angel. For a long time, I had no idea where the name Sarah Angel came from, and I still have no answer for the first name Sarah, but I know now that the maiden name of Charles Bowling's mother-in-law, who was not related to me, was Angel. Somebody assigned the surname Angel to the wrong grandmother, but had I taken the death certificate for granted, I might still be looking for a non-existent ancestor named Sarah Angel. But there are other situations when inaccurate birthplaces or names recorded on documents such as these mean something. 7 years after starting my genealogy research, I had definitively traced my male line lineage to a Revolutionary War soldier named Christopher Height, who lived in Bedford County, Pennsylvania. And I was excited to come across the grave of a daughter of his who lived until 1886. That meant I could find her on the 1880 census, which would give the birthplaces of her parents, and none of Christopher's other children had lived that long to my knowledge. And I was pretty sure Christopher had been born in Pennsylvania, but I wanted evidence for that. But when I looked her up on the 1880 census, the birthplace of her father was not given as Pennsylvania. Instead, it was given as Baden. Baden at the time was the southwesternmost of the German states, and I was already sure the family was of German origin. but the idea that Christopher himself had been born there really made no sense. The man I was almost certain was his father had arrived in the country in 1751, and Christopher was not born until about 1759. Immigration to the American colonies had almost entirely ceased from 1756 through 1763 because of the 7 Years' War, and I had evidence that the family had probably been in that part of Pennsylvania by the beginning of 1763. But I thought maybe Baden did have something to do with the family's background. I started checking the Mormon Church's International Genealogical Index for families with the German spelling of my surname in Baden. I eventually focused on the village of Grotzingen, about 50 kilometers south of the city of Heidelberg. The family there used a lot of the same given names that the first couple of generations of my family in the country had used. More than a decade later, when Y chromosome testing became widely available, I located a man with a provable lineage to the Height family in that village. Our Y chromosomes matched. We have a common male line ancestor. I've now been to this village on 6 separate occasions and have become good friends with some distant relatives who live there. Even though Baden was not Christopher Height's birthplace, it was the birthplace of his father, and I might never have found that out without the inaccurate entry about Christopher's birthplace in the 1880 census. That's the only record I've found in this country that pinpoints a specific German state as my ancestral home. What this example, and the example of the inaccurate name of Charles Boland's mother on his death certificate show, is that it's necessary to verify all sources as much as possible with others. Certain information on specific types of records is particularly vulnerable to error. But even when these items turn out to be incorrect for the specific purpose involved, one must consider the possibility that they reflect something that is true. Charles Bowling's mother's maiden name was not Sarah Angel, but his mother-in-law's name was Angel, and so even though that surname had nothing to do with my lineage, it does figure into the ancestry of his direct descendants. Christopher Height was not born in Baden, but his father was, and learning that enabled me to locate ancestors in a specific village there. We are hoping, of course, that some of you will eventually come in to utilize our resources. That being the case, we're going to give you a few tips for preservations of the materials you may review. Some of our records are quite old and must be handled carefully. Some of our collections are on the shelves and can be accessed directly by researchers. One thing to avoid when taking books off the shelves is pulling them by the head cap. That is, the top of the binding. This will eventually tear the binding and the damage will worsen over time. It's better to pull a book somewhere in the middle. And if a book has been shoved in too far to grab it by the middle, I would suggest pulling out an adjoining book. Again, not by the head cap, to free space to get a hold on the book you want. When researching loose items, which will usually be in folders, materials should be kept flat on the table, and they should also be left in original order. They should be moved deliberately and with care to avoid damaging them. Some of them are a bit fragile. And also, researchers should try to handle only blank areas of pages. This is also true for bound materials that are brought into the reading room from the vault. In the case of these bound volumes, supports should be used for the bindings when available. Reading room staff can provide items for this purpose. Finally, no pens should be used to take notes in the reading room. Only pencils can be used for that purpose. The reading room staff can provide pencils for researchers who don't have them. No food or drink are permitted in the research area. And as a security measure, researchers will be asked to check any and all bags they bring with them, including purses. We have lockers for this purpose. Patrons are allowed to use their own laptops, notebooks, and other papers in the reading room.
All right, thank you very much, Rich. That was really excellent. We're actually going to shift now. We have a couple of questions that we received, so I'm going to pose these to Rich, and he can answer them. If as we go through this question and answer portion, if you have anything you would like to add, please do drop it in the chat. There should be a little button on your screen that looks like a thought bubble. Just click that, and you'll be able to type that question so we and everybody else can see it. So our first question, Rich, is are death certificates filed in multiple states for the same person?
That can happen, but it's rather unusual. It usually only happens in the state in which the person died. There are instances, though, when, for example, if a Rhode Island resident happens to die in Massachusetts or another adjoining state or even a state far away while on vacation, that a copy of the death certificate from that state will be sent to Rhode Island. And we would maintain, in those cases, we would maintain it. But generally, you have to go to get the record from the state in which the person died.
Does the state archives have any resources for out-of-state deaths?
Yes, there are. There are a collection of out-of-state death certificates, which are kept in the archives.
Perfect. Okay. Our second question: what is the best place to search online for my family records?
Well, generally, online resources are a bit sporadic. Ancestry.com, if you have a membership there, is a likely source, although they, of course, are not comprehensive. They only have what they've been able to obtain from various government entities. And in those cases, it's really best to be able to look at the actual source. If all they have is a transcription, I would suggest going to the original source, because transcribers are not, who they hire are not necessarily always perfectly accurate in reading the records. I have found some transcribed records on Ancestry.com that I happen to know already are inaccurate. FamilySearch.org, which is the Mormon Church's site, has some original documents online as well. And then looking around the country, there are certain state archives that have some scanned original documents online. That varies widely from state to state. But depending on where you're looking, it's always worthwhile to check the archives website.
Great. That also sounds like a good opportunity to let all of you know that the state archives currently doesn't have all of our vital records digitized. However, if you know the name of the ancestor you're looking for and the type of record, you can send us a request and we will pull and make a copy of that record and send it back to you. So while our records aren't fully digitized, we can still make them accessible to you. So it looks like we do have a question in the chat. So Rich, this says, what is the strangest thing you've learned in doing your own research? And what is your favorite source to look through?
Well, okay, I'll take the second part of that question first, because that's an easier one to answer. You know, I would say what's been most useful to me through the years has been census records, because you know, most of the state, you know, the states my ancestors are from usually don't have vital records far back enough to be to my benefit. I happen to have ancestors from Rhode Island, but they left Rhode Island before the state started keeping vital records. The strangest thing, that's a very good question. I guess this came about from comparing a published county history with some actual documentation. I happen to have ancestors in North Carolina by the last names of both Oates and Cogdale. And prior to the families intermarrying, there was a quarrel in the family in which one member of the Oates family killed a member of the Cogdell family in a supposed duel.
Wow.
But a county history source about the Oates family noted that the Cogdell family member who was killed had been a Tory, and that the Oates family member who killed him had been a staunch patriot during the American Revolution. This account was written probably 100 years after the death of this Oates ancestor. But primary research later revealed to me that the Cogdell family member who was killed, his name was David Cogdell, had been a delegate to North Carolina's Constitutional Convention in the late 1780s. But the father of the Oates who killed him was named Jesse Oates, and Jesse's father, Jethro Oates, had actually been charged with treason against the state of North Carolina for providing supplies to the British.
Wow.
So the true story was actually a complete reverse of what was reported in the county history. However, the information in the county history was taken from Oates' descendants, no doubt. And through the years, I think the story had gotten distorted.
So that goes back to your written oral history comment.
Exactly.
That's actually really fun. I like that. Okay, so here's a question from me personally, because I have veterans in my family. So where would I go if I wanted to get records about ancestors or relatives that were United States veterans?
Well, if they're not in the records included in the state archives, and the archives collection, particularly for more recent wars, is pretty limited, the National Archives is generally the best source. And of course, there are branches of the National Archives all around the country. The closest one to here in Rhode Island is the National Archives branch in Waltham, Massachusetts. For further west in New England, there is also one in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, but that is generally the best location.
Okay, all right, perfect. This is one that I think people either think about a lot or not at all, so I think you'll be interested. It says, will the DNA kit results, if you do the Ancestry.com or 23andMe, will those results help me with my genealogy?
They certainly can, but you have to be careful about jumping to conclusions, particularly with more distant relationships.
Okay.
For me personally, the Y chromosome DNA test was extremely helpful, but that only tests, direct male line connections. My Y chromosome matched that of a man whose last name was spelled differently than mine, but we derived from the same German spelling of our surname. His ancestors came to this country a century more recent than mine had, which made it easier to find records on where his were from. That enabled me to find my specific ancestral village. The types of tests that are offered, by by Ancestry.com, 23andMe, those typically only indicate if you're related to someone or not.
Okay.
And it's not as easy to determine how. Now, an example I run into here in communicating with relatives, and this again involves height relatives, as it happens, there is a very prominent height family with origins in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, who are not related to me at all. I had long thought they were not, and the Y chromosome DNA test proved that. But descendants of that family do show up among my relatives from the Ancestry.com test. But further investigation will reveal that I'm related to those people in other ways. For instance, one of them turned out to be related to me through a family named Butler that is on my mother's side.
Right.
Another one ended up being related to me through a Hogue family from upstate New York that I'm a descendant of through my paternal grandmother. I get the more distant the further back you get with those, the less beneficial it is.
Okay.
One thing though that's worth knowing is for fairly close relatives, in a situation in which someone in the family, if there might be a question about the paternity of a particular individual, for instance, those the Ancestry.com type DNA test will usually confirm or deny that. If you're as closely related to someone as a second cousin, it's going to show up if you're if a second cousin takes the test, you take it, and you don't match, well, then you know something unexpected is in the lineage.
So it can be very helpful, but it's not like a one-stop shop solution.
Exactly.
For genealogy. Okay.
Exactly.
Perfect. So we have just 2 more questions. This one I thought was pretty interesting. And I don't know if it goes back to the military records question. It might not. It says, is there a source that would tell me the religious affiliation of any of my ancestors?
Well, the sources for that here at the archives are limited, but there are possibilities. For example, marriage records, particularly more recent ones in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, would often give the name and station of the person who performed the wedding.
Which might include the denomination.
Exactly. If it was almost certainly there if it was a Roman Catholic priest. Sometimes it could just say minister, but then it might be a little more specific, like Methodist minister or Episcopal minister or something like that. There's also a potential clue in death records because particularly by the time they started issuing death certificates, they would usually indicate where the person was going to be buried. And if it was a cemetery at a particular church, then that's a very strong hint that the deceased is a member of that church. You can't take that for granted because some very large church cemeteries would eventually become cemeteries for the community as a whole. But it is nonetheless a clue worth pursuing.
Great. Perfect. All right. So our last question, and this is sort of something I've wondered a lot, to be honest, because as you look at family trees and build them out, they seem to just sort of exponentially grow, branches and branches and branches. So this question says, do I really need to know about my ancestor siblings?
Well, it can be very helpful to know that because you might find clues researching siblings that you don't find from your direct ancestors. And one of the examples I cited in the talk was the great-great-grandmother who died in 1889, too soon to have a death certificate in North Carolina, but I found her brother who lived until 1949 and got his death certificate.
Right.
Again, it turned out to have a false information about their mother, but it did give me their father's name. And the other thing is, it does help sometimes, okay, if you check an ancestor's death certificate, gives one particular set of parents. If you can also check the death certificates of 2 or 3 of the person's siblings and you find out that they all match, that strengthens the case that you've got the right parents for the family. And then when there are variations in that, for instance, okay, I have a great grandfather whose death certificate did give the correct name for both of his parents, but I already knew this from the census, but for 2 of his brothers, their death certificates gave the wrong name for the father. And so, for descendants of theirs who had found just those death certificates and just assumed the name of the father on it was right, they would have had, they might have looked at for the wrong name for years in their research. So
it's always worth looking at least a little.
It is, definitely. And if you're just putting together a pedigree chart that only starts with yourself and, list and direct ancestors, of course, it's not really space for including that, but it's still worthwhile to maintain the information in some format.
Perfect. Okay, that brings us through our list of questions, and we haven't received any more in the chat. So I would like to thank you, Rich Height. Thank you for your presentation and for sharing your genealogy expertise. I thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We will be uploading this to YouTube and sharing it so that it's accessible if you'd like to watch again. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact us here at the State Archives. Our phone number is 401-222-2353, or if you'd like to reach out via email, send it to statearchives, all one word, @sos.ri.gov. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope we hear from you soon.